This podcast is brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. This is episode number 11. I am your host, Sydney Jones, and today I am with my really good friend, Ken Klehm. He is the head distiller at 450 North Spirits in Columbus, Indiana. This is a new distillery that is attached to a world-class brewery. And we are going to be talking about several different things today. The 30 spirit portfolio that he created when he was distilling down in Georgia, including liqueurs and all the challenges that come with that. Distilled specialty spirits. This is something that Ken and I love talking about. And kind of the pros and cons of starting a brewstillery and considerations of a startup distillery. So we're going to get into all of that. But before we do, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering that your team needs at no cost to you. Jim Kerr, VP of Manufacturing at Red Boot Beverages, says, G&D has been with us since the early days. Their knowledgeable engineers and service techs are there when we need them. We're in the midst of a large expansion, and they have been there with us to select chiller solutions for today and the future. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. And for more than 11 years, ABS Commercial has been your full-service equipment manufacturer, designing quality distillation equipment ranging from 50 liter to 5,000 liter. Whether you're establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brewstillery, their team of experienced engineers and designers works with you to develop customized distilling solutions. With their consultative approach, they tailor to your production capacity, space constraints, and budgetary considerations to help you create quality crafted spirits. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized distilling needs. Hi, Ken.
Howdy, Sid. How are you?
I'm so good. Ken traveled down from Indiana today with his partner, Bridget. And Ken is one of my oldest friends, and this is the first time I've seen him since, was it Denver?
Yeah, ACSA in Denver.
Yeah, we were both at the American Craft Spirits Association conference, where Molly and I kicked off this podcast, which is wild to think about now that we're on episode 11, which is crazy. But here we are, and thanks for listening. But I got to know Ken really, really well many moons ago. How many years ago was that, Ken?
7?
5, 7? Man.
7, 8?
Where does the time go?
I don't know.
I don't know. We don't even think about it.
It's multiple jobs ago.
Multiple jobs. Ain't that the truth? I was vacationing in Savannah pretty regularly because I was still distilling in Florida at the time. And Ken was running a distillery down in Georgia that I really like. I kind of like stumbled into it and forced Ken to be my friend. Would you say that's an accurate statement, Ken?
Not entirely. You took the tour and you started asking questions that no 25-year-old person should have been asking.
I was a baby.
Yeah. And our dear friend Chantel, who was the tour guide at the time and now is turning out the good juice at Corsair, she didn't get stumped very often because she was studying hard and wanted to be a distiller, and she now is. So I had to step in and actually answer some of your questions. And then she's like, hey, Ken, come to the tasting room. You have to talk to this woman. And that's how we became friends.
So sometimes, and I'm going to apologize if you're listening to this podcast and I come to visit your distillery, I've got it better in check now than I did when I was a child, like 7 years ago, according to Ken. But I would go on tours and my enthusiasm would outpace my self-control. And I would just ask like not inappropriate questions, but questions that like I had no business asking on a tour.
One of them was, where do you source your GNS?
Well, okay. Did I ask that?
Yes.
I did. But not in like a creeper way. It was just a like, oh, I'm working with GNS too. And these are the things that I'm running into. And I would love to just like gush and gush and gush over it because I am a nerd who has no life. That was the approach. I do not suggest going into distilleries and asking where they get their GNS.
But you made friends.
That was a very dumb thing. I did make friends. Doesn't always work out that way, but I did make friends in this case. But the really incredible thing that I was like so obsessed with at this distillery, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
In September 1st, 2017, Georgia law changed. And they basically went from, hi, if you want to sell spirits out of your distillery, you had to sell it to her. And before anybody paid, they had to decide whether they wanted to pay extra to take a souvenir bottle home. And that was your only sales. And you can only sample up to 1.5 ounces. And September 1st came around and they said, okay, you can have a full-on cocktail bar with the stipulation that everything that contains alcohol that are in your cocktails, you make in-house. And because I had bosses who had no idea what they were asking for, decided that they wanted to have a full-on cocktail bar. So we ended up going from the end of August, having 2 things behind the bar. And we were going to just a vodka and flavored vodka. And then we were going to come out with a couple of flavored whiskeys because it was young. Stuff was young. We didn't do everything properly aged. And that was in the plan, but suddenly we went to 2 and then the next day having 20.
So the thing I was so excited about because I was young and dumb and I was very invested in, the cocktail community in Florida at the time. They had their own fernet and that just absolutely blew my mind because I was so accustomed to Fernet Branca, which I still love very much to this day. I wear Fernet sunglasses every single day. But it's true. But your Fernet absolutely blew my mind. It was so incredible. It was so well balanced. It was nothing like Fernet Branca, but everything that I wanted in a digestive.
Well, it's closer to Luxardo's Fernet because it was based on spearmint, not eucalyptus. So it wasn't menthol, it was minty. And that's the biggest difference. Had a lot of strange, bitter things. I mean, I never expected until I was doing research that I would put myrrh in a drink.
Yeah, which is, so you said about 30 different things, which were as boring as like, a flavored vodka to really cool, like a Fernet and a chartreuse substitute.
One that we got cease and desist on. We could keep making it. We just had to change our verbiage. I was not allowed to use the word chartreuse or Carthusian or even the word monk when talking about it.
Oh, the monks are sensitive.
I don't know if the monks cared. It was the company that owns the rights. An Italian style bitter. So it was definitely in the Campari land and as close as we could come to making a vermouths that weren't called vermouths because we weren't a winery and jumping through all those hoops. And it was we really developed those recipes, got the formulations and colas all in 2 months.
So to this day, whenever I have questions about formulation or liqueurs or anything of this nature, Ken is the person that I call because he came up with this entire crazy, intense portfolio seemingly overnight. And not only that, but you were working with so many liqueurs and you were proofing them, correct me if I'm wrong, but without the densitometer attachment. Like you were doing it with an obscuration still in your lab, right?
Yeah, I was doing 2 and 3 obscurations a day.
Which is crazy because those take so long to do. For those of you guys that don't know, if you are trying to get like a proof on something that has sugar, the density of sugar will mess up your reading in a densitometer or a density meter analyzer, whatever you call it, like an Anton Par or a Rudolph meter, whatever you're using to take your proof. If you have sugar in it, it will mess up that reading because of the sugar content. So you have to get specialty equipment to attach to those already specialized pieces of equipment, and they're extraordinarily expensive to do. So a way to kind of bypass that is you can do kind of a miniature lab distillation on whatever you are trying to add sugar to, and you can distill the sugar out of it to get an accurate proof of what you're working. Would you say that's a good kind of
basically
layman term? The problem with this is it takes forever to do. It's very labor intensive. And I used to have to do it quite a bit when I was in Florida. And it's very hard to like land on a consistent proof unless you get really, really good at it. And sounding like you got really, really good at it.
I got better. I was much better at year 5 than I was at year 1.
Yeah. And they take like, the ones I ran were 2 to 3 hours, and you're just sitting there watching this little glass still bubble and go drip, drip, drip. You can't let it go too long because that'll mess up your reading, and you can't let it go.
Make sure it's going too fast because it'll boil over, or many times I have had the flask break.
Yeah. They're very sensitive, but it's really the only way to get your proof if you're working with liqueurs and you don't have like the several $1,000
I always
attachment.
said that we had an Anton Par DMA, whatever. And then when we got the alcoholizer attachment, which is the one that's a sugar, it's like, well, the DMA is a fairly well-equipped Honda Accord. So
Development of them, because I've developed things, but I've developed things one at a time, and you developed 30 things at a time.
Okay, first, I have to say that I have a collection of old 19th century distillery manuals. Most of them are in English. I don't really speak other languages, but the French ones, I fortunately have a good friend who's French who translated a few recipes for me. So I was dig deep into books, and it all started, I wanted to figure out the magic that is chartreuse way before I was a professional distiller. When I may or may not have been, I'll just call it doing extracurricular studies for a degree. Maybe before even I started my degree. But anyway, I really wanted, how was this made? I came out of barland into production. So I loved cocktail, I love things, and chartreuse is magic in a glass, in my opinion. So it's how is this made? And like, okay, it's a secret. Like, there's no such thing as a secret. There really isn't. Somewhere it's written down, and I started searching, and I found a chartreuse recipe. And then I found others and was working there and trying to see what I could figure out what it was called back then versus what it's called now. Because, 150 plus years and difference. Plants are called different things. And then does the TTB let you use it? I mean, if anybody wants to play, I have a recipe for white chartreuse that has not been made by the monks since 1905. But it has tonka beans in it, and we cannot use tonka beans in America. Anybody who is not in America and can use them because they're legal in Europe, hit me up. I will give you the recipe because I want to taste this.
Yeah, the TTB has this really fun thing called the generally recognized as safe list of ingredients that you may or may not use. And sometimes they send you letters when you submit formulation saying, hey, like, we have not recognized this as a safe thing, or someone somewhere along the line told us that it was an unsafe thing for some reason or another, so you cannot use it. And then you have to get kind of creative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And, this was, a lot of that research was done, and a lot of the list was made in 1968.
1968. My question with recipes like that, and in your trials, especially, because I'm sure you were, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were developing this chartreuse, were you tasting established chartreuse next to it to kind of see,
yes,
kind of develop quality standards for it? Something that I wonder quite a bit with anything that is botanical forward and driven, so gin, Amaro, things of that nature, flavored alcohols that are using these natural elements. We're seeing that the elements themselves are changing, as, climate is changing. They're growing in more stressed out, really extreme conditions. And that is doing things to flavor. Like Campari tastes very different now than it did, 50 years ago. And it's curious to me, those recipes that were developed way back when, the continuity in developing a quality program to keep them consistent. And, when you made the recipe, did it actually taste like it was in the realm of chartreuse, or had botanicals changed so much that they didn't scale anymore?
It was in the realm. It was like, it wasn't, an exact match, but can we know what chartreuse that wasn't sitting in a bottle for 40 years tasted like 40 years ago? We can find some now that maybe it's been in a bottle for 40 years. In a personal example, I have some bottles of Angostura bitters that my great uncle had in his home bar. When he died in 1974, they're untouched. So when my great aunt had to have her house cleaned out and I was cleaning out his bar, there was no alcohol left. But here were some bottles of Angostura from, early 70s. Mm-hmm. Let's just say it's a totally different beast. These are sealed bottles. It tastes so much better. They dumbed down the recipe.
It's so interesting too, because I work with a beverage laboratory in Lexington, Kentucky, and a good friend of mine is doing some research there about volatility in alcohol specific to like gin and other things that use like really delicate top notes and aromatics and, their shelf life. Do we see a degradation of these products, especially once those bottles are open? So a few weeks ago, I was touring around Bardstown because it's what I do now on the weekends. I just go to museums, and there was a museum that was selling vintage nips of like really cool stuff, like gin from like the 70s and scotch from the 80s. And like I have an Amaro that I don't know where it came from. I can't find any information about it online, but and they were selling them very cheap, and they were filled and they were sealed. So I bought a gin one, and I'm like, this is going to be this is either going to be amazing, or this is going to be the worst thing I've ever drank in my entire life. And it was the worst thing I've ever drank in my entire life. All the gin character had just completely dissipated in it. So the research they're doing right now is to kind of compare these like degraded samples to like a gas chromatography machine and see, chemically speaking, what are we tasting and what are we not anymore, just given time and the interference of oxygen and sunlight and all these extreme conditions. So I wonder things like that with especially like vintage chartreuse, because there's a bar down the road that has vintage chartreuse, and I have a lot of questions for it.
Yeah, I have questions too. I probably don't have the pocketbook for it.
That's fair. But you made chartreuse. You made a chartreuse substitute. Mm-hmm. And you made kind of close to a vermouth.
We call them an aperitif, but we had to work out of a neutral spirit. We couldn't call it vermouth because we weren't a winery, and only wineries can make vermouth, was my understanding.
What was the trickiest liqueur that you worked on? Because you had to stock essentially an entire bar. So you needed to make an aperitivo, you needed to make a vermouth, you needed to make a chartreuse. What was kind of the weirdest, trickiest thing?
I really like our maraschino. Yeah, the maraschino was just weird. And that was the one that just evolved and evolved and evolved over the years.
The maraschino, from what you've told me of the maraschino, because we talked about it at the American Craft Spirits Association conference, is one of the wildest spirits I have ever heard of. Please tell our listeners all about this liqueur, because it is insane.
Well, I'll tell you how the process ended up. Is we first brought in cherry syrup, both Montmorency and Balaton syrup from Michigan, and then made wine out of it. Meanwhile, to try to get some of the nuttier tastes that come with, your typical Luxardo, I found a website that's called, I think, cherrypits.com or cherrypitstore.com. And they just sold 50-pound bags of cherry pits to use for crafting. So we'd take them, we'd wash them, and then we would dump them in GNS with a bunch of almond flour.
Hey, Kim, what GNS do you use?
Oh, man. That was MGP's grade 9.
That was a very sarcastic.
That's not what we use for a good vodka there. It's what we use for our cheap vodka there, because that was the cheapest GNS we could find.
#, questions you don't ask. Anyways, please continue.
Anyway, so we soaked those, soaked all that in GNS to get it out. And then we would take everything and dump it all in a still and distill it. And then add just an extreme amount of sugar and proof it down to 30% and call it a day. But it was just fermenting and soaking and putting it all there, just trying to get that flavor.
Yeah.
And I never got the beautiful weirdness that is in Luxardo. This is had more of a stronger nutty flavor, but it was really delicious and a great sugar modifier for cocktails.
Yeah. So was that working off a recipe that you found before?
No,
that was just kind of coming up with it and tasting a bunch of different maraschino liqueurs and
just Luxardo. And how do you get those flavors? I mean, I didn't have the budget to bring in the proper cherries. Mm-hmm. And I know that, Luxardo takes the cherries and they just strip them from the trees, and you have the pits and you have the leaves and the twigs all go into the fermentation there, which is what gives it some of that oddness.
That green.
How do you get that? And part of it is the pits.
Yeah.
The pits are fermented in it and they're distilled in it. And so that's what we were trying to obtain. And we started off with actually saving the peach pits for when we made our peach liqueur, because Georgia. We made it with real peaches and saved our peach pits and started macerating those first. And it turns up that this maraschino started selling, and we had to realize we had to make it more and more and more. And it wasn't no longer something we could make once or twice a year. When peaches were in season, we had to make it all the time.
You're going back and forth between all of these different what kind of difficulties did you go through? I'm imagining the cleaning that goes into switching in between all of those different things and the bottling headache that goes between. It sounds so romantic to be like, yeah, we make 30 different, and it is. But from a logistical standpoint, I have never imagined the scope of what you did. It really is miraculous because it's not just creating the thing, it's also bottling the thing.
It's rule one is you always have to leave one tank empty.
Yeah.
Because you always have to filter into another tank. So you always have to have one empty. If you don't have an empty tank, you're really up the creek. If an operation is done well and the sales team gives you your expectations and when you need things and a schedule, it wouldn't be bad. If you have to walk into work every morning and go to the production manager and say, hey, Rob, what changed today? And you'd get, oh, yeah, we got an order for this and this and this. And you have to suddenly figure out how to make something that takes 2 weeks to make to get it ready because they have an order out for it that they didn't tell you until that morning and you have other things in process. I'm bald for a reason.
You're not completely bald.
Yeah.
You got hair. I'm looking at it.
At least I'm over 6 feet tall, so most people don't see the worst of it.
So before we go any further, it's worth talking about if you're planning a distillery or a brewery launch, adding a distillery to your brewery, or considering purchasing an existing brewing or distilling business, then visit breweryworkshop.com for more information about the Brewery and Distillery Workshop, brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling and Craft Beer and Brewing. Over 4 days, you'll learn what it takes to get a successful craft beverage business off the ground through panel discussions, working group sessions, technical tours, and a whole lot more. Get your ticket now at breweryworkshop.com. So I bring that up because you created this incredible career on making all of these different liqueurs, all of these different products. You made like 7 different bourbons. You made rum, you made vodka, you've made literally everything under the sun. It is insane, including my favorite category, distilled specialty spirits. And that's something you're still working on, but you are now in Indiana versus Georgia at a literal brewstillery, which is something I've never worked at before.
It's I don't know how to phrase this. It's a wine brewstillery. We have all 3.
You have all 3. That's a lot going on under one roof.
Yeah. And my boss, runs them all, and he still farms 600 acres.
So tell me a little bit about 450 North Spirits, because it's a new operation.
The spirits are a new operation. I mean, quickly, the family-run business. Family has been farming that piece of land since the 1850s. 24 or so years ago, he decided to grow grapes and grow wine. A little from a previous guest who I have the utmost admiration on. It was Lisa Wicker's first job in the industry picking home grapes.
We love Lisa Wicker.
I hope to meet her one day because she is someone who I look up to.
She's my neighbor. She lives several blocks away from me, which is crazy to say.
Anyway, so I started a winery, and then when his twin sons, they graduated college, they decided to open a brewery, and they built a little restaurant. And this is 10 miles outside of town, well, about 3 miles outside of town, but in the middle of a cornfield. And who would have thought a little restaurant and brewery would do well, but it did well. And they started making this strange style of beer that they call slushy, but they're extremely hot fruited sours. And so they start with a sour beer base and add a huge amount of fruit purees and other strange ingredients to it. They have strange names. They make 10 new ones every month.
Wow.
Those and like really double, triple dry hopped double IPAs and things. So 10 new beers a month, and they developed a cult following for these. So they have a stable of fairly straightforward beers for their restaurant. And they have these famous and very experimental, unique beers that they make that go all over the world at this point, and from middle of a cornfield in southern Indiana. And they grew. And so they had to build a bigger restaurant attached to a bigger brewery. And then they even had to expand that a bit because they needed more canning production and everything. So there was an empty building. And they took the empty building, like, what are we going to do? There's a building that's doing nothing. So they decided, well, we like whiskey too. Might as well do all three. And they opened 450 North Spirits.
It's crazy thinking about it. So I've never worked at a brewstillery or a wine distillery or a wine brewstillery, which is what you're working at. It seems like there would be a lot of pros. You know, you have access to, especially one that is also a working farm. You have access to a lot of
the corn,
really incredible grain and really incredible grape and fruit and, you know, beer as well. You know, it sounds like you have like a lautering operation, and, you know, you could make some incredible things. It sounds like the operation I would want to build in like a video game, you know, but I'm sure there are also a lot of complications with that as well. Are you guys using any of the same equipment? Is there contamination issues? Is there regulatory issues? Like, what are the things that you've ran into that really surprised you with that?
There are, you know, been some transfer and bond things like, you know, we make brandy. Well, the wine's made in the winery and we bring it over. Or he has wine that's made that isn't going to make it to a bottle. Well, the wine's perfectly good. Let's distill it. We've played around with distilling these strange slushy beers. And we're going to start releasing them in-house sometime soon because it's weird and wonderful, and I can't really describe what they taste like. But a lot of these things have, I think the last one we did had 32 different ingredients.
So you made like a suicide.
Yeah, of all the beer that's like, okay, you know, you have 3 months to sell it.
Like the little kid at the soda fountain who just takes all of the flavors of the, you did that.
We had to, you know, this was 1,800 gallons of beer, of cans we opened.
So someone was just standing over a tank with
multiple people.
Amazing.
Opening 16-ounce cans and inverting them in a glass rack for a dishwasher.
So from like a regulatory standpoint, we talked a little bit about, you know, distilled specialty spirits or distilled spirit specialties. Would that be considered then a DSS? Because I can't think of anything else it would be. It's got fruit in it and it's got grain in it if it's a beer. So
it would have to be a DSS. And I am really looking forward to writing that
formula for it.
Because every single one of those beers has a TTB formulation.
Oh, God.
So I'm going to say it's 12% of this number formulation and it's 6% of this number formulation. Ask me my entire formulation.
Oh, whatever TTB agent gets you is going to be so pissed off that day.
But it's like, these are all, it's just things that are already approved formulations.
Yeah.
That have been distilled.
Yeah.
So they can't say there's anything in it that wasn't approved.
What is the effect of pouring 30 things together that you don't really know and distilling it? I mean, is it a cohesive product? Is it, let's just see what happens and let's do it?
There was a lot of that. I mean, we've done it a few times. There are times when you say something and people who don't know distilling don't listen. And I was like, let's not put IPAs in because I don't like the way hops taste when they're distilled. They just get, especially things that are dry hopped, they get bitter, more and more bitter. And like, oh, that has a bitter note. It's like, yes. So when we just did the slushies and no IPAs, it's almost like fruit stripe gum. so many layers of fruit. You know it's fruit, but you can't necessarily pick out any at only one time. Or, you know, someone says like it's Willy Wonka and the snozberries taste like snozberries.
It's fruit. It's kind of fruit. We don't entirely know. It's Schrodinger's fruit. Is it there? Is it not?
Oh, it's there. There's something. It's all sorts of flavors behind, you know, it's the unaged whiskey base.
Yeah.
Because it's going in at 5%, 5.3 roughly percent.
What are your plans for the distillate? Are you guys going to be aging it? Are you guys going to just be bottling it as kind of like a weird eau de vie? Could you even call it eau de vie? Would it be eau de grain?
I think you can call it a beer schnapps.
Okay.
And we'll probably, because please everybody go look at the 450 North beer names. They're very frequently creative, and the market is placed towards a lot of people who enjoy a substance that is not legal in the state of Indiana, but most of our neighboring states.
Does it rhyme with marijuana?
Yeah, basically. Like our friend Anna Bliss. No, but their marketing is very colorful, bright, vibrant. The spirits are marketed, labeled and very differently, but it's going to be some sort of play between these two. We'll probably only sell in-house because even though we're distilling, 1,800 gallons, it still only starts off at 5%. So when you distill that 2 times, and we're probably going to release it at 100 proof, there just isn't that much. So it's not something we're going to try to release out the market. It's like if you are a fan and come, or we will. We have a crazy beer fest in the first weekend of every October called the Corn Maze Beer Fest. So if you ever want to come to a beer fest that has 5,000 people, and this year's 110 breweries in the middle of a corn maze, show up.
Indiana.
5,000 people were there last year.
It's a lot of people.
Yes.
He says with trepidation. Yeah. So this is a new distilling operation at a very well-established company that has you guys have an identity. You're making these slushy beers, beer smoothies. You are making wine that has an identity, and you are the first distiller that they've hired. You've gotten this off the ground.
Yeah.
How are you developing this kind of, I talked a little bit about this on a previous episode with Connor O'Driscoll about developing a house style and honoring a house style. What kind of house style are you trying to create with M450 that you would say, having all of these different elements in the mix and also doing experimental weird DSS stuff? For those who are unaware, DSS, distilled spirit specialty, it's just the catch-all phrase that the TTB does not really understand and know how to categorize. So it sits in its own category. It's basically the unicorn category. If you have a spirit that doesn't fit into other definitions of what alcohol can be according to the TTB, it goes into DSS territory. Anyways, back to my question.
It's not a flavor style. It's a philosophy style, I think. It's a idea. So with the brewery having its reputation built on being extremely experimental, we have to keep playing into that. But at the same time, the advantages of being a farm distillery are tremendous. We spent year 1 using a bunch of different corn and tasting the new make until we decided on, we like this one the best. And so my bosses planted a bunch of this non-GMO hybrid red corn that is not named, it's just a number. And the new make we made out of that was fantastic. And we just had 2,000 pounds of it. And we saved enough to plant about 20, 30 acres and made the rest into a whiskey. And it's really good. So that's what will probably start being the house style. But it's the philosophy is to be experimental, but also we're in South Central Indiana. All we have is grain. So my boss doesn't grow the wheat. His cousin does 2 miles down the road. We have people growing rye for us. We have people growing barley for us. So, and this is all within a 5-mile radius. I can look out my window and see the corn that I'm going to use. And it goes a mile, maybe a mile and a half down the road to get dried. And it comes back and sits in the silos on the property. And then it moves from the silos into my personal hopper for my distillery hopper. And then John picks it up, who's our farmer, and takes it a mile down the road to feed the cows. That's all it travels. And that's just amazing to me. And that's one of the things that really excited me about my current job when I was out hunting, that and they offered me the job. But it was like the opportunity to really not just work with your farmer, but your farmer's basically dictating with you what they're growing and how they're growing it for you and, you know, where it's going to be. And, you know, we grew some heirloom corn. He grew some heirloom corn last year and he had to hide it because it didn't look good and you didn't want his neighbors to think he was a bad farmer. Because it's thin and it bends over. Yeah.
That farmer gossip, man.
I was like, David, you're 64. You've been farming this land your whole life. They know you. They know you know what you're doing.
No, it's really interesting talking to, you know, farmer producers. You have such control over what you're working with. You can control your, you know, your growing conditions with you can control what exactly you're growing. You can control your fertilizer. You can control so many different things, and all of that filters into more control and potentially more consistency for your product. Were you working with a grain broker for your grain down in Georgia when you were distilling?
We were working with a grain elevator about 100 miles away.
Yeah.
So 102 by Google Maps, but less than that as the crow flies. So we could still say it was local.
Yeah. What are some of the differences that you're seeing between the grain growing in your backyard versus grain that you were sourcing from 100 miles away?
No offense to Georgia corn, but it's not Indiana corn. And no one is going to say it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why the Midwest has corn, because it is so much better. There's so much more flavors. The oils are insane how much corn oil I'm getting off it, especially when I'm doing all the vodka. You just see it as just pools and pools and pools. And it's all this flavor and so much more sugar. Mm-hmm. It's nuts. It's beautiful. And
that's such an interesting point, because I think oftentimes when you have craft distilleries starting up, especially if they're attached to a brewery and or a winery, and you're starting up and you're trying to figure out, you know, who are you as a distillery and what are you standing for? And everyone loves, you know, local, local, local. And I'm a big proponent of that when it makes sense. And getting grain that maybe does not make sense for you in terms of distilling spirits for the sake of getting it local, I think is a question that you kind of have to ask yourself. Like, do I want to be able to say that I can get this grain a few miles away when it's not the best product? It's grain that's grown for a very different purpose than what I want to use it for, but I can say that it's local, you know? And I think that's oftentimes something that people don't consider when they are dreaming up their Sims dream distillery, brewstillery, winery.
There are decisions that are made for marketing, and there's decisions that are made for budgets, and there's decisions that are made for flavor. And I think in any company that is run with multiple people, those decisions are going to get argued over.
Absolutely. And there's no right answer, you know? Maybe that local grain does work better, even if you're not getting the flavor you want from it, just from a budgetary standpoint or a marketing standpoint. But it's a very tricky balancing act that you kind of have to play around with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's questions that I see that are being asked like further into the process and not immediately when you are starting up your new distillery, you know?
Well, when you open up your new distillery, I don't think you're thinking about those details for the most time, because you have to think about the engineering. And is the city going to make you, wherever you are, make you do this or this or this for safety? Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's the hardest thing, is all those details that like, oh yeah, local corn's great. And, you know, I know there's some people who start distilleries who know what they're doing, but most distilleries, when they open, need to hire someone who know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And hopefully they do. Both distilleries I've worked in, I was not hired months and months and months before they're doing it. It's like, okay, well, you walk in and here's the equipment you're going to use. Now you got to figure it out. All the design has been done. And you have to walk in and figure out how you are going to do it when someone else designed it in a way that might not make sense to you. Mm-hmm.
No, for sure. It's just something that I've heard quite a bit over the years. And, I know you've been thinking quite a bit of, distillery startups, because that's what you've essentially had to do here from the ground up. Were there specific challenges up in Indiana with getting a distillery off the ground, a craft distillery, especially one attached to other businesses?
The answer is yes, but
the answer is always yes. There's always complications. It's never easy.
The first time I came up for my third interview to take a look at the place, all the equipment was sitting there. It was done. And it was, 3 weeks later that it was wet tested and fired up. So it was basically all in place there the first time I saw it. So I'm like, okay, in my head, I'm running through and trying to figure things out. I went from one system to a whole different manufacturer and to a cooker with chilling coils inside to one that doesn't. And I'm looking like, well, how do I chill a mash? And the answer is you add cold water to it. But that means I get, okay. And no offense to manufacturers, I hate that.
I did that in Chicago. Not necessarily because we thought it was a best practice. It's because we struggled so much with our chiller, especially in hot Chicago heat, that we found that was the best way that we could feasibly get our mass temperature under control, was adding cold water to it.
And, trying to get as much corn, and this is not the smartest way to do it, but this is the business end, try to get as much grain as possible into your cooker to get as much alcohol out per workday as possible. It means I can't put as much grain in my cooker because our cooker we work at a 600 gallon pot still. And so the cooker's 600 gallons, but I have to save 250 gallons of water to bring it from,
Yeah.
We'll just keep numbers simple, 200 to 150.
Do you stagger it with your addition? Start with a low level and your corn, and then take it through, boil, and then...
Yeah, I start with the corn loader, add enzymes, bring it, then bring it up.
Boil it, and then cool it to your malt or rye or wheat addition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I like to let things sit a long time. I have time I can do... With my current still, it takes me about pretty much almost 8 hours on the nose to start up the still and do a low wine. So I'm cooking the same day. I can finish that. I start at 8 a.m. And that's normally done by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So if I want to let it mash for a good 60 minutes, I have plenty of time.
Yeah.
So I do let it sit. And, I've played around with step mashing because I do appreciate what that does to beers. But is it figuring out how this equipment works? And, I have still pretty thick mashes, and it doesn't really work well with our heat exchanger. And when you have a really long heat exchanger going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it clogs, that's not a fun cleaning process.
Yeah, I would say so.
So I've stopped using it for my bourbon.
Interesting.
And I pump into my tanks. At 150-ish, 148, hopefully. I'm hitting that number because that's where I want to be. And figuring that, okay, I let it sit overnight. And I add the yeast the next day. Oh,
wow. And how's your beer chemistry looking with that? pHs and everything?
Most of the time, really good. When I started doing it, I was really nervous. And the only bad part is because I love the fact that I work Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
From 8 to 4:30-ish normally. High wine days is normally a 10-hour day. So one day we can work 10 hours. But if I do a cook on Friday, then I have to blow air through it or something to get it cooled down enough to pitch the yeast. A few hours before I leave. So I'm like, I might have to have a beer at the restaurant as I wait for this to cool down. Darn.
Have you had any sort of contamination things with that slow of a cooling process?
No, we have close fermenters.
Oh, that helps. Yeah.
So I don't think I'd do it if I'd open fermentation, but pumping in that hot, basically.
You're pretty sanitary at that temperature. Yeah. And I guess the nice thing is, have you adopted brewery level, cleaning protocols onto the distillery side.
No.
I was going to say. So if you guys...
There's a reason why I don't want to be a brewer.
Yeah. If you guys are unaware, brewers have to go through a hell of a lot more cleaning than distillers do.
And wineries.
And wineries as well. Yeah. For sanitation purposes. The nice thing about distilleries is that we're self-sanitizing and we're going to boil the hell out of it. So we don't have to keep things as necessarily clean. But that being said, there's a lot of really good practices that brewers have developed with their cleanliness protocols. So you're not necessarily taking it full insane brewery CIP level, but
there's a few thousand pounds of raw agave nectar waiting for me when I'm on vacation right now when I return to work on Monday. And so sanitation is going to have to go up a bit for that round.
For sure. I've never worked with agave nectar. Have you worked with agave nectar before?
Yeah, I hate it. It took me 3 sessions to get it to the point where I was not angry at it.
Yeah.
By 3 sessions, like 3 years cycles.
I've tasted things distilled from agave nectar, and they're definitely, obviously, very different than other agave spirits that are made in a traditional manner. It doesn't
like to ferment.
Mm-hmm.
It needs a huge amount of nutrients.
I was going to say, you have to doctor the hell out of it, kind of like if you were distilling honey, right? Like it's so sugar dense. You really have to add a lot.
You literally put in your wash is maybe 12 bricks.
Mm-hmm.
So really low concentrations. I took my rum nutrient regimen and doubled it.
Yeah, we're just going to throw all the vitamins that we can at it.
And that got to work, and realizing that I'm then going to have to let it ferment for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And keep your fingers crossed. So even if you've been very clean at 2 weeks, the last time I did it in Georgia, show up at a week and a half and come like, oh, that's a nice pellicle.
But hey, you don't have to cook it.
That one went to the still early.
Yeah. It always blows my mind whenever I'm thinking about, agave nectar fermentations or like rum fermentations. And, you don't have to go through this crazy cooking process that we have to do with grain. And sometimes I wonder, like, why do we do this to ourselves? Man, I could just be making rum. I could just be pumping out molasses and just fermenting it and sending it straight to just a still.
When I did rum and agave, I would always pasteurize it and cook it first. So it's not, but yeah, it's just so much easier.
Yeah. Backtrack. I've made rum. It's not that easy. But there's still a lot of things that can go wrong with rum. Yeah, a lot. I could never get my fermentation to tank off the way that I wanted to, probably because of, nutrient issues. Now that I'm looking back at it, I don't think we were dosing it correctly the way that we should have, but
yeah, it's one of those things like manufacturer's recommendation of yeast. Normally I figure you just cut it in half and you're doing right. Manufacturer's recommendations that I found for nutrients, I just double. And so it was quadruple for agave.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. What product is that going to make at the end of the day for you guys? That's going to be a new addition, or
it's going to be, an agave spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It's really in-house only. It's sort of the fun thing is you have this beer nerd beer that people come from all over the country to, and then you have all the regulars at the restaurant who, drink lagers and ambers. And we have a really nice porter that's year round, and they just drink beer flavored beer, and they eat the brick fired pizza and burgers. And so it's really to be able to say, hey, let's have a margarita. And that's the logic behind it.
Just really throw them for a loop there.
It's when we added cocktails, it made a difference. And they make some pretty fancy, nice cocktails. But at the same time, there's also, when I left, there was, a wheat whiskey with peach tea on tap. And people love it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just easy, and there it is. And people are buying those too. So yeah, let's have a margarita.
For sure. Considering that you have the infrastructure for it, is American Single Malt on your horizon?
It's in barrels.
Tell me about it, because that's the big thing now that's gaining so much traction and so much publicity and so much interest.
We got our malt from Sugar Creek Malt House, which is just north of Indianapolis, about less than 80 miles from us. And they also only buy grains from within 100 miles of their place. And they grow a lot of their own. And we use what they call it's a pre-prohibition 6-row. So it's more of a beer 6-row than like, your typical distiller's malt. It had a good amount of sugar. So we went all with that. And it's delicious malt. It was beautiful. Anyway, so we did that. It's 100%. So it's, Indiana grain again. And didn't bring it to the brew house. So we've done some stuff where we brought it to the brew house and shipped the sugar water over. But this was all we did on grain.
Nice.
And we have some in used barrels and some in new barrels. So you see what the difference is.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see what that difference is too. I'm a big fan of on-grain American single malt whiskey production. I think that on-grain fermentation is one of these things that makes American whiskey American, know? And I think we get a lot of really cool flavors from those fermentation practices. Not that I'm against lautering, but there's just something about grain on fermentations that I really gravitate towards in terms of, I think, my production style. I just really appreciate them.
I agreed. And it's maybe it's me wanting to stay in my building and not jump into the other building on the big brew house, or have somebody else do it for me. One of the things I love about my job is I'm really, really hands-on. I know that one day my body will not tell me I can't do it anymore. But I do like the fact that I'm still, I get help, but I am pretty much a one-man operation. I put my earplugs in and listen to my stories. Sometimes it's your friendly voice.
This podcast.
I listen to booze podcasts as I make booze. And just go to work and do my thing. I hang the hoses. I mop the floor. I don't want it any other way.
Yeah. And I think that really is one of the things that makes craft distillery so special, is that you can connect it to individual faces and individual people and individual efforts. And that's sometimes harder with a larger company where that's making hundreds of thousands of barrels a year. Speaking as someone who, works for a company that makes hundreds of thousands of barrels a year, but there is a lot of this really beautiful notion of that alcohol is a man-made thing, distilled spirits is something that would not exist in nature, and really connecting it to a person. I think there's a lot of really cool storytelling that happens within that.
Agreed. And, it's having been in this industry long enough to have made spirits and tasted them when they're fully mature. It's wonderful. And then when you go back to, me, I like my spreadsheets, and I can look at a barrel and say, this barrel is barreled here. So it came from this fermentation, and this is this. And like, oh, this one is when I forgot to reset the scale. Right. And so it's got 200 extra pounds of corn in it, and taste the difference from the barrel from the next one. Because that happens.
It happens.
Then you taste a difference, or that if just something wasn't working right in the machinery at those times, and you can see what happens. Or, probably you're doing a distillation and you're just really tired and want to get out. And you hate to say this, but I know I'm not the only person who's somebody just like, I'm cutting the tails early.
Yeah.
Like, I need to be out of here. I can't take it anymore. And whether I cut the tails 3 or 4 percentage points early, like, that's good enough.
Yeah.
That will affect the flavor.
Mm-hmm.
But is anybody going to notice? And at that moment, you're like, yeah, no one's going to care. Mm-hmm. No one knows but me. And no one knows barrel at me. It's going to blend with others. There is that, just in craft, there's more the hand of the person makes it, the thumbprint. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I ever want to lose that in my outlook and what I do. And I'm not saying anything bad about large mass-produced distilleries, because I sure drink a lot of their stuff and enjoy it immensely. But, when I talk to bourbon collectors, they're all talking about this label and that label and this cap and what this means and this thing. And that doesn't mean anything to me. I am more interested in, I want to taste the bourbon made from that old man at Wood and Hat Distillery in Missouri who was carrying that corn cob
cob in his
flint corn that he's been breeding for 14 years to the perfect thing to make bourbon
Gary. Yeah.
Yeah. And he does have his master's degree in agronomy. He knows what he's doing.
He's incredible.
And it's like, I sat and talked to him about that ear of corn that he kept in his pocket the whole convention. And I'm going to go there and taste his bourbon one day because that's what I find interesting.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great point. It's true. Well, I think that is kind of the perfect note to end on. I can't think. We wound down perfectly. Okay. Yeah. Congratulations to us. We did it.
Yay. And I just want to thank you for asking me because there are a lot of people you've already had on this podcast who I absolutely look up to and have maybe a bit of hero worship towards. And to be on the same group makes me feel I'm a bit blushing right now.
Well, that's the great thing about this industry is that we kind of all are obsessed with each other. We all have giant professional crushes on each other. It's really what I've found in my career so far is that
I think we're all just crushed out on that.
Yeah.
Big bearded guy in Carhartt overalls in Denver.
Every single podcast I do, I bring up Todd Leopold and you did it now. I have to. Yeah. No.
Come on. We all have a crush on him.
I know. I have to get him on. I need to reach out to him for an interview. Todd, if you're listening, expect my email very soon. But before we go, for more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has had the proven solution for distilleries. Visit them today at gdchillers.com. Whether you're establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brewstillery, ABS Commercial is your full-service equipment manufacturer for equipment ranging from 50 liter to 5,000 liter. Visit breweryworkshop.com to secure your ticket to this September's Brewery and Distillery Workshop. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. Ken, if people want to learn more about 450 North Spirits or the brewery or the winery or all of the amazing things that you guys do, weird and otherwise, where would they go to dig a bit deeper?
Well, 450 North Brewing and 450 North Spirits both have websites of those.com and their Instagram and probably Facebook and other things. If you want me, my handle on Instagram and Twitter, which I'm not the best poster, but there's things, is I Get Others Drunk is my handle.
Just all one word, all lowercase.
Yep.
I Get Others Drunk.
Because it's kind of what I do.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.